The shuttle's descent through the atmosphere of Asterion 9 felt more like a fall than a landing. The craft rattled violently, its outer panels glowing with heat as it pushed through the thick gray clouds that blanketed the entire planet. The cadets of the Galactic Academy sat strapped into their seats, silent, their helmets reflecting the flickering emergency lights. The navigation systems had long since lost contact with orbital satellites. Even the autopilot complained with bursts of static. For most of them, this was supposed to be a short survey mission, a formality to confirm what the Academy already knew, that Asterion 9 was uninhabitable. When the shuttle finally touched down, the ground swallowed its legs into a crust of dust and ash. The air outside shimmered with a faint, toxic mist. The planet had once been part of a grand experiment, an attempt to terraform worlds using a combination of engineered microbes and atmospheric reactors. But something had gone wrong centuries ago. The reactors melted under their own heat, releasing metallic vapors and corrosive compounds into the air. Since then, no expedition had lasted more than a few weeks before abandoning the effort. Eli Mercer, the only human among the team of 7, stared out through the viewport as the dust storm cleared enough to reveal the horizon. The landscape was an endless plain of dull gray ridges and fractured ground, like the skeleton of a world that had been burned alive. The others, 3 Valerians, 2 Solth, and 1 Dren, were already muttering complaints through their comm links. To them, this place was just another death zone. The Academy's declaration was absolute. Asterion 9 was a failed world, stripped of purpose. When the command was given to disembark, Eli stepped onto the surface and felt his boots sink slightly into the brittle crust. A metallic taste filled his mouth, even through the filter of his respirator. His visor display blinked with warnings. Air quality, unsafe, toxic particulates, high, visibility low. He crouched, scooped a handful of dust, and let it fall through his gloved fingers. It sparkled faintly under the pale light, almost beautiful in a way that none of the others seemed to notice. Survey team, mark your coordinates and begin atmospheric sampling. The commander's voice barked over the channel. We'll be here for 72 hours before evacuation. Let's make it quick. The cadets spread out, dragging sensor poles and deploying small drones. Each one moved with mechanical efficiency, focused only on completing the checklist that would allow them to leave this place as soon as possible. Eli followed the procedure, but his gaze kept drifting toward the horizon. In the distance, a faint shimmer of movement caught his attention, something reflecting the light in rhythmic pulses. He zoomed his visor and saw that the ground was uneven there, marked by what looked like fractures or veins. By the second day, morale had collapsed. The toxic winds had eroded the outer shell of their portable lab, forcing everyone to huddle in the central cabin of the shuttle. The Solth cadets argued that the mission was pointless, that no data collected here would change the Academy's classification. The Valerians blamed the atmospheric interference for corrupting their equipment. Even the commander admitted that nothing of significance could be salvaged, but Eli didn't share their resignation. When the others slept, he stayed by the viewport, watching the strange flickers that danced across the plains at night. The planet's surface glowed faintly under the storm clouds, as if something deep beneath was trying to breathe again. On the third day, a message from orbit arrived. Mission terminated. Shuttle to return immediately. Planet remains uninhabitable. The crew cheered quietly, their relief obvious. Everyone began packing up, securing samples, and dismantling the damaged drones. Eli, however, lingered near the airlock. He looked once more at the horizon, at that faint shimmer that no one else seemed to care about. Something inside him whispered that there was more here than decay, that the world wasn't dead, only waiting. When the last of the cadets boarded the shuttle, Eli stood apart. "Mercer, what are you doing?" the commander asked through the open channel. "We're leaving." "I know," Eli answered. His voice was calm, almost detached. "I'll stay behind to finish the ground report." "That's not in protocol. You'll die out here." "Maybe," Eli said, his eyes still fixed on the gray expanse. "But if this planet once lived, it can live again. Someone has to prove it." The commander hesitated, then gave a short, irritated laugh. "You're insane, human. The atmosphere will eat through your lungs in a week. Suit yourself. The Academy won't send another ship back for months." Eli didn't respond. The airlock closed, and the shuttle's engines ignited with a roar that shook the valley. Dust rose in violent waves, and the ship lifted off, climbing toward the clouds until it vanished completely. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, Eli was truly alone on a planet that everyone else had given up on. He took a slow breath, his visor fogging slightly. "Let's see what uninhabitable really means," he murmured. The first days were a test of endurance. His portable habitat was designed for short-term missions, not for permanent residence. The air filters strained constantly against the acidic atmosphere, and his power cells dwindled faster than expected. Each night, storms rolled in from the northern ridges, filling the sky with streaks of electric green light that cracked across the clouds like veins of fire. The thunder here didn't rumble. It hissed, as if the very air was corrosive to sound itself. Eli began mapping the surrounding area, marking each ridge and crater with makeshift beacons. He discovered remnants of old research stations, collapsed domes, half-melted metallic pylons, shattered containers still marked with the faded insignia of the original terraformers. Inside one, he found a collection of glass vials, sealed and coated in layers of gray dust. The labels were unreadable, but the samples inside shimmered faintly under his flashlight. He stored them carefully, not knowing yet how valuable they might be. As the days stretched into weeks, he grew accustomed to the silence. The world was harsh, but consistent, honest in its hostility. Each morning he walked farther from his camp, searching for anything that hinted at biological persistence. Once, near a dry riverbed, he found a patch of rock with strange markings, tiny pits and channels arranged in fractal patterns. Under the microscope in his lab unit, he saw traces of carbon and dormant bacterial spores. Against all odds, something microscopic had survived here through centuries of corrosion and neglect. That discovery changed everything. For the first time, Eli felt the weight of possibility pressing against him. The planet wasn't lifeless. It was wounded, poisoned, and forgotten. But beneath the ashes, life still waited for a reason to return. He stood on the edge of that cracked plain, the wind biting through his suit, and looked out across the endless expanse of ruin. In that moment, he made a silent promise to the world itself. He would stay. He would build. He would try. As the second storm season began to roll in, the human cadet who refused to leave started gathering scraps from the wreckage around him. The other cadet's tracks had long since vanished beneath new layers of dust, but Eli's footprints formed a growing web of paths radiating outward from his shelter. He patched the cracks in his habitat with molten alloy, built a crude wind barrier out of plating and melted pipes, and started collecting atmospheric moisture using the condensation from his own exhaust filters. Each drop felt like a victory, proof that the air still held the potential to nurture. On the seventh night, as the storm raged and lightning illuminated the wasteland, Eli stood outside his shelter. His suit sensors screamed warnings about radiation spikes, but he ignored them. He looked up at the sky, a sky without stars, just shifting clouds and the dim outline of the dying sun filtered through ash. Yet, in that chaotic emptiness, he saw something familiar: resilience. The same force that had driven humanity across galaxies, that had made them survive every failure. Asterion 9 had been abandoned by every intelligent species that came before him, but for Eli Mercer, it was no longer a dead world. It was a challenge, a mystery, a canvas. He didn't yet know how to heal it, how to make it breathe again, but he knew he would not leave until he tried. And so, with the storm howling like an ancient voice of defiance, he sealed the doors of his shelter and began writing the first line in what would later become the planet's new history. Day 1. The others have gone. The world is mine to wake. When the first dawn finally broke through the thick, iron-gray clouds, it came not as sunlight, but as a pale shimmer that rolled over the horizon like smoke. Eli stood outside his shelter, his suit coated in dust, the air around him humming faintly with static. He had been awake for most of the night, listening to the low groans of the wind and the creaking of the metal panels he had welded together to survive the storm. Now, in the eerie stillness that followed, he began to plan. The planet wasn't going to kill him immediately. He had learned that much. Its toxins were slow, its radiation diffuse. If he was careful, he might even have time to test whether the soil beneath his boots could remember what it meant to give life. He began with the ground. The dust, once disturbed, drifted and settled like ash. Beneath the brittle surface crust, he discovered a thin layer of clay-like sediment that held faint traces of moisture. It wasn't much, but it meant the atmosphere still interacted with the ground. There was a cycle. Even if it was broken, Eli collected a dozen samples, sealed them in containers, and began to analyze them inside his small habitat. The portable microscope flickered as he powered it on. Under magnification, the soil looked inert, gray, and lifeless, until he increased the contrast. That was when he saw them, faint threads, so fine they were almost invisible, embedded deep within the sediment. Dormant bacterial filaments, desiccated but intact. It was enough to make his heart pound. He decided to test whether they could wake. He prepared a small sample dish, added a droplet of distilled water, and left it under the faint heat of his lamp. For hours, nothing happened. Then, as he was adjusting the oxygen levels inside his habitat, he glanced back and froze. The droplet had changed color. It was faint, just a ghostly tinge of green spreading outward like breath against glass. But it was movement, proof of reaction. He leaned closer, his visor almost touching the lens. The filaments were stirring. The realization struck him with the weight of revelation. The planet wasn't dead. It was sleeping. From that moment, his focus shifted. He would no longer treat Asterion 9 as an enemy to endure, but as a patient to heal. He needed to build an environment that could protect and nurture these fragile beginnings. He scavenged through the wrecks of old research domes and found fragments of transparent alloy panels that could still filter radiation. Piece by piece, he constructed a crude greenhouse near the thermal vent he had discovered during his first week. The vent exhaled faint streams of warm vapor, rich in minerals, and though it stank of sulfur, it was energy, a sign that the planet's heart still pulsed beneath the surface. He built the structure slowly, using melted connectors and sealing each gap with a resin he extracted from native fungal growths that clung to the rocks like gray lace. When he heated the resin, it released a sharp metallic odor, but once it cooled, it became tough and flexible. By the end of the third week, his greenhouse stood like a fragile bubble in the wasteland, a clear dome gleaming faintly in the toxic air. Inside it, the temperature stabilized a few degrees above freezing, enough for him to remove his gloves for the first time in weeks. He took out the small pack of earth seeds he had kept hidden in his survival kit. Potatoes, beans, and a few samples of moss spores, remnants of a research project he had once conducted back on Titan Station. He placed the seeds carefully into small plots of moistened soil, mixing the dormant Asterion dust with earth compost stored in nutrient gel. To others, it would have seemed futile, but to him, it was the beginning of communion between two worlds. He watched as condensation formed on the inside of the dome, small droplets gathering along the seams and falling softly onto the soil. By the fifth day, thin shoots of moss began to appear, tiny green veins creeping across the black earth. The beans took longer, their stems pushing through only after the first artificial light cycles he had rigged from his remaining power cells. When the first sprout unfurled a leaf, he almost laughed aloud. The air inside the dome was beginning to change. The readings on his oxygen sensors ticked upward by a fraction, almost imperceptible, but real. The human presence no longer felt alien. It was being mirrored by the planet itself. Outside, storms continued to carve scars across the plains. The wind still carried its metallic sting, and every now and then, Eli had to reinforce the dome's base with scavenged plating. Yet, despite the violence beyond, the space inside the dome grew calm and vibrant. The smell of soil mixed with faint humidity filled his lungs through the filters of his suit, and he imagined that this was how Earth must have once smelled before humanity left it behind. As the days stretched on, Eli began recording his progress in a new log. He no longer wrote about survival metrics or atmospheric readings alone. His notes became personal, observations about how the green light reflected off the inner surface of the dome, how the moss seemed to grow faster when he adjusted the vent to release warmer air at night, how the soft sound of dripping condensation gave rhythm to his solitude. He wrote about hope, though he never used the word. One night, while reviewing his readings, he noticed something unusual. The oxygen levels outside the dome, within a 2-meter radius, had increased slightly. It was impossible according to every atmospheric model the Academy had created. He recalibrated the sensors thinking it was a fault, but the readings persisted. He stepped outside, knelt, and dug his fingers into the soil around the dome's base. The texture was different, less brittle, more cohesive. The The condensation from the greenhouse had been leaking through microcracks in the structure, seeping into the surrounding dust, creating small pockets of dampness that nourished the bacterial colonies below. Without meaning to, he had started the planet's first feedback loop. He returned inside, exhilarated. If this small dome could alter the environment even slightly, what could 100 do? 1,000? His mind began racing ahead, sketching possibilities on the inside walls of the habitat using soot and melted polymer. He envisioned networks of domes, each connected to the geothermal vents, each breathing warmth and moisture back into the planet's lungs. He imagined a chain reaction, one that could transform the air from poison into breath. To test his theory further, he constructed a smaller experimental unit a few meters away, just a transparent cylinder with soil, moss, and a thin film of algae. Within a week, the algae began to reproduce faster than his control sample inside the main dome. The faint light from the thermal vents contained trace radiation that, instead of destroying the cells, seemed to stimulate their growth. Asterion 9's toxins, he realized, could be transformed into nutrients if managed properly. The planet didn't need to be tamed, it needed to be listened to. The work consumed him. His sleep cycles shortened, replaced by bursts of energy as he monitored growth, adjusted filters, and repurposed scrap material into irrigation tubing. He constructed condensers to collect more water from the air and developed a rudimentary filtration system made of sand, charcoal, and heated stone dust to remove acid residues. Every new improvement made the dome's interior more self-sustaining. The plants responded, thickening their stems, deepening their color. Even the fungi outside began to change, adapting to the new conditions and spreading toward the greenhouse in irregular patterns. The human presence had begun to alter the planet on a molecular level. Life was calling to life, and the answer came through slow, almost imperceptible shifts. The sky above his dome, once a solid wall of gray, began showing faint tinges of violet during certain hours, refraction caused by new particulate formations in the air. He watched them from his shelter window one night, the faint color spreading across the horizon like bruised dawn. It was subtle, but it was beautiful. For the first time since his arrival, Eli allowed himself to imagine permanence. The air he breathed, even filtered, felt less hostile. The soil under his gloves was no longer just dust. It was the foundation of something growing, something awake. He began to call the greenhouse the heart, because it pulsed with warmth and breath while the rest of the world lay silent. In the evenings, when exhaustion finally forced him to rest, he would sit near the vent, helmet removed, letting the filtered air of the dome brush against his face. The faint scent of earth, the quiet rustle of leaves, and the rhythmic hum of his machines lulled him into a strange peace. He often thought of the others, his fellow cadets, now light years away, who had dismissed this planet as dead. He wondered what they would say if they could see it now, if they could witness how the so-called uninhabitable world had begun to inhale again. The human spirit, he realized, was not merely about endurance. It was about transformation, the stubborn insistence that even in ruin, there could be renewal. And as he drifted into sleep, surrounded by the fragile sounds of life reborn, Eli understood that he was no longer surviving Asterion 9, he was becoming part of it. By the time the first storm season rolled back across the plains, Eli's greenhouse had become more than an experiment. It was his entire world. The air inside was rich with the smell of damp soil and young roots, a scent he had not known since his childhood on Earth. The plants had grown taller than he ever imagined possible in such conditions, their leaves thick and glossy from adaptation to the filtered light. He had begun reinforcing the structure with layered plating and resin, trying to make it withstand the turbulent climate patterns that the sensors had warned him about for days. Still, nothing could have prepared him for what came from the northern horizon that evening. He saw it first as a dull shimmer in the distance, like metal reflecting fire. The sky thickened into a wall of colorless clouds that rolled faster than any natural weather pattern should. The winds shifted direction abruptly, bringing with them a vibration that made the metal panels of his shelter hum like struck glass. When the first drop of rain landed on his helmet, it hissed. He lifted a hand, and the droplet left a faint burn mark on the glove. Acid rain, stronger than any he had recorded before. He rushed toward the greenhouse, sealing the vents and locking down the external power lines. The storm hit seconds later. It was not rain. It was an assault. Sheets of liquid corrosion slammed against the dome, sizzling and steaming as they rolled down the curved panels. Lightning arced horizontally across the sky, white and silent, leaving afterimages that danced on his visor. He crouched inside the control chamber, watching through the glass as the world outside became a blur of gray fire. The noise was deafening, a mix of metallic scraping and thunder that felt alive. Within an hour, the outer coating of the dome began to peel. The resin sealants bubbled and cracked under the chemical onslaught. Eli worked frantically to patch the breaches from inside, welding strips of melted alloy into place. Every repair was temporary. The heat of the storm distorted the materials faster than he could reinforce them. He could hear the structure groaning as if the planet itself was testing his resolve. Then one of the main support panels gave way. The impact blew debris across the greenhouse, sending shards of metal and droplets of acid into the air. Eli ducked as a fragment struck his shoulder, slicing through the outer layer of his suit. He felt the sting immediately, like fire crawling under his skin. He didn't stop. He tore open the emergency sealant pack, smearing the substance across the breach in the dome. The mixture hardened instantly, sealing the gap for a few precious minutes, but he knew it would not last. The storm raged for 16 hours. When it finally began to weaken, Eli's oxygen supply was almost gone, his power cells drained to a critical level. He had burned through nearly all his reserves to keep the atmospheric filters running. The once clear panels of the dome were now opaque, etched with scars from the acid rain. He stumbled outside as the wind died, his boots sinking into the mud that had formed from the runoff. It wasn't the sterile gray dust he was used to. It was black, thick, and strangely fertile. Steam rose from it, carrying the sharp smell of minerals and decay. He knelt and touched the ground cautiously. The mud was warm. His sensors flickered with readings. Iron, carbon, nitrogen, all enriched far beyond the soil he had worked with before. The acid had torn apart the surface layer, breaking down compounds that had been locked for centuries. What had nearly destroyed his work had also awakened the planet's deeper chemistry. Life, he realized, was rewriting itself from the wreckage. Inside the damaged greenhouse, he found that half of his crops were dead, their stems burned and twisted. Yet in the corners, where runoff from the vent had mixed with the acidic rainwater, the moss had multiplied. It clung to the cracks, thick and luminous, glowing faintly green in the dark. He crouched beside it, exhaustion forgotten, and watched how the moss expanded along the fissures, creating tiny networks of veins that carried moisture deeper into the soil. It was self-replicating, adapting faster than he thought possible. The bacteria in the soil had transformed the acid into energy, feeding the growth instead of killing it. He decided not to fight the storm's aftermath, but to use it. The damage had created new possibilities. Over the following days, he redesigned his systems entirely. He built channels to collect acid rain into filtered reservoirs lined with stone dust and crushed bark from the native fungal growths. When the acidic runoff passed through, it neutralized and released trace minerals. He used this purified liquid to irrigate the remaining plants, and within a week, the results were undeniable. The beans sprouted new leaves. The soil turned dark and rich, full of micro-organic motion when viewed under his microscope. But the storms kept coming. Each one reshaped the land further, carving gullies and exposing veins of shining minerals that reflected faint light even during the planet's dim days. Eli adapted in rhythm with them. He began constructing external barriers from melted scrap metal, shaping them into curved shields that redirected the runoff away from the greenhouse's base. He layered these barriers with hardened resin and lined them with moss, allowing the vegetation to trap and store moisture. Over time, the barriers transformed into living walls, half biological and half mechanical. The human touch had begun to merge with the planet's will. His camp no longer looked like an alien intrusion. It resembled something that had always been there, grown rather than built. The green glow of the moss spread beyond the immediate perimeter of the dome, tracing the paths where the rainwater had flowed. At night, those veins of light pulsed softly across the dark plain, a constellation of emerald threads shimmering against the wasteland. Eli recorded every development meticulously, though part of him understood that no report would ever capture what he was witnessing. The planet was no longer just reacting to him, it was collaborating. The acid storms, once the greatest threat, had become the catalyst for change. The toxic rain had broken open the Earth's crust, releasing nutrients, while his constructed systems guided their transformation. It was as if the planet had been waiting for something, or someone, to initiate its rebirth. Then came the night when the winds returned stronger than ever before. He had been reinforcing the last section of the outer wall when his motion sensors flashed red. A surge in atmospheric pressure registered higher than any previous reading. He barely had time to retreat into the shelter before the next storm unleashed itself upon the land. This one was different. The sky burned with flashes of violet lightning that split the clouds open like torn fabric. The ground quaked under each strike, and for a moment, Eli feared the entire valley would collapse. He sat against the control console, suit sealed, listening to the storm howl. But amid the chaos, something strange began to happen. The dome vibrated, yet the structure held. The new barriers absorbed the force of the wind, channeling it through the moss-lined walls that acted as shock absorbers. The plants inside bent but did not break. Their roots had anchored deeply into the renewed soil. He watched as rainwater streamed through the channels, purified as it passed through layers of moss and bark, then returned to the greenhouse reservoirs. His system was working. When dawn returned after that storm, the valley had transformed beyond recognition. Pools of black water shimmered in the low light, reflecting streaks of green and blue from the bioluminescent moss. The air tasted different through his filters, less metallic, almost breathable. The dome, though scarred, stood firm amid a landscape that looked alive. Birds did not yet sing, and no insects buzzed, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was the silence of waiting. Eli stood at the edge of his camp, the acid-scarred soil soft beneath his boots. He removed his gloves and held a handful of the dark mud in his bare hand. It no longer burned. It felt warm and damp, full of potential. He looked up at the horizon where faint clouds gathered again, but this time he didn't fear them. The storms were no longer just destruction, they were creation in disguise. He turned toward the dome and touched the metal plating, its surface warm from the vent's breath. "You tried to kill me," he whispered, his voice quiet but steady. "And in doing so, you showed me how to make you live." That night, as he sat inside, watching the moss flicker like a constellation of tiny stars across the walls, Eli realized that he was no longer simply a visitor. The planet had accepted him, reshaped him as much as he had reshaped it. The line between survival and purpose had blurred. He was no longer the cadet abandoned on a dead world. He was the first inhabitant of a living one, and his creation was only beginning to breathe. Months bled into seasons, though on Asterion 9 time was measured less by sunlight and more by the rhythm of the storms. Eli no longer marked his calendar with Earth days. He lived by the pulse of the planet, the quiet before the rain, the whisper of thermal winds that swept through the ravines, the slow expansion of the green. His greenhouse had multiplied. What began as a single dome had grown into a small network of structures linked by tubes, reservoirs, and moss-covered channels. The soil around them no longer glowed faintly green. It radiated life. The air had softened, the toxicity falling gradually until his instruments began returning data that defied logic. Eli had stopped wearing his respirator indoors. The air inside his domes, now partially shared with the outside environment, had reached oxygen levels once thought impossible on this planet. Each breath filled his chest with a lightness that no synthetic filter had ever provided. He spent most of his days reinforcing irrigation systems, planting more hybrid seeds, and building wind deflectors along the ridges to redirect the acidic gales into his filtration traps. His hands were scarred, his clothes patched with crude repairs, but his face carried a calm that came only from creation. Then came the day his scanners picked up an incoming signal. At first, he thought it was another of the planet's electromagnetic anomalies, but as the readings stabilized, he recognized the unmistakable frequency of an Academy ship. The identification code pulsed across his monitor. A-17 Explorer Class, Command Unit, Galactic Academy. For a long while, he simply stared at the signal. He had expected this moment once during those early weeks of isolation, but as the years had passed, he had buried the thought. Now, the sight of it stirred something between pride and unease. By the time the ship entered the atmosphere, the entire valley trembled under the power of its thrusters. Dust rose in rolling waves, scattering flocks of newly evolved winged organisms, creatures that had formed from hybrid moss growths and native bacteria that had adapted into airborne spores. Eli shielded his eyes as the vessel settled near the ridge where he had first built his shelter. When the landing ramp descended, he saw the same insignia that had once dismissed this planet as lifeless, now reflected in the dull green light of his reborn world. A group of officers emerged, humans, Valerians, and one Dren scientist, all wearing the latest atmospheric suits with polished visors and glowing filtration seals. They walked cautiously, their instruments blinking furiously as they tried to comprehend the data around them. The commander, a broad-shouldered human with silver insignia, stepped forward. "Identify yourself," the amplified voice commanded. "This area is restricted under Academy protocol. No colonization is authorized here." Eli didn't move at first. He stood on the slope above them, the wind carrying his voice as he replied, "You're standing on the colony you abandoned." The team looked up sharply. One of the scientists whispered something into her communicator, scanning the terrain. "Impossible," she murmured. "The atmosphere is registering 30% oxygen, negligible acidity, stable nitrogen levels. This can't be right." Eli descended slowly, his boots pressing into the black soil that shimmered under the weak light. As he approached, the officers stared at him with disbelief. His suit was no longer standard issue. It was a patchwork of repaired materials layered with living moss along the joints to filter toxins naturally. His face was rough, sun-worn, but his eyes burned with quiet clarity. "You're supposed to be dead," one of the officers said, her voice trembling with awe. "I was," Eli replied calmly. The planet disagreed. The commander exchanged uneasy glances with his team, then gestured toward the domes. "What happened here? These readings? This can't be natural." "It's not," Eli said, "but it's not artificial either. It's harmony." He pointed toward the nearest dome, where vines of hybrid vegetation climbed the walls. The atmosphere, the soil, the bacteria, they all adapted. I only gave them a push. The Dren scientist crouched, scooping a handful of soil into a sample vial. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. "Terraforming success without reactors, without interference. This could change every model in the Galactic Handbook." Eli shook his head. "Terraforming failed here before because the process tried to force life into shape. It was arrogance. I stopped fighting the planet and started listening to it. Everything that grows here is native, just awakened." The commander looked around, visibly unsettled by the sight of green mist rising from the nearby ponds. "And you did all this alone?" Eli's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "No one does anything alone. The planet helped." For a moment, silence settled among the visitors. Then the commander turned to his team. "Document everything. We'll take samples, run diagnostics, and prepare a full report. This could redefine uninhabitable classifications." He turned back to Eli. "The Academy will want you debriefed. You'll be honored for this achievement." Eli's expression didn't change. "Achievement?" He looked around at the valley, the living streams, the whispering plants, the soft hum of the wind through green canopies. "I didn't do this for them. I did it because it deserved to live again." The commander frowned. "You understand this planet belongs to the Academy. Under council jurisdiction, you'll have to leave temporarily for evaluation." The words hung in the air like poison. Leave. After everything, the storms, the years of solitude, the fragile balance he had nurtured. Leave. Eli stepped closer, his voice steady but cold. "If you try to take this world apart, you'll kill it again. It's not a specimen. It's alive." The Dren scientist spoke softly. "He's right, Commander. Interference at this stage could destabilize the ecosystem. It's still in equilibrium development." The commander hesitated, then exhaled heavily. "We'll relay the data to headquarters and await instruction." Over the next few days, the team built a temporary research outpost near the ridge. Drones swarmed the air, mapping the terrain and capturing thermal imagery of the expanding biosphere. Every night, the valley glowed under their floodlights like a captured miracle. Eli stayed apart, observing them from a distance. He knew their intentions: study, replicate, control. To the Academy, this was a discovery. To him, it was home. One evening, he found the Dren scientist outside, studying the glowing moss that spread across the ground like a living map. "It's reacting to your presence," she said. "The bioluminescence intensifies when you walk near it." "It's not reacting to me," he answered. "It's breathing with me." the same air, the same rhythm. She looked up at him, her large amber eyes reflecting the soft light. "You changed it, Eli. But it changed you too." He didn't deny it. "I used to think survival meant resisting a hostile world. Now I understand. It means becoming part of it." Days later, the commander received transmission clearance from the Academy. He read it aloud before the group. Authorization granted for environmental containment and extraction protocols. Begin preparations to collect key samples for controlled laboratory reconstruction. Eli's hands clenched. "You'll strip it bare." "It's procedure," the commander replied. "We need controlled conditions to understand what you created." Eli's voice was firm. "I didn't create it. You can't reproduce it in a lab because it wasn't built by calculation. It was born from patience and adaptation. You'll destroy what you're trying to learn from." The commander's tone hardened. "You don't make those decisions anymore. You're coming with us." Eli turned toward the valley. The green shimmer spread far beyond the domes now, reaching the base of the distant cliffs. He could hear the soft rustle of the wind through the leaves, as if the planet itself were listening. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he faced the commander again. "If you take samples, you take me, because every root here grew under my hands. Every molecule of air carries my breath. This planet is no longer yours." The silence that followed was heavier than the storms that once tore the land apart. Finally, the Dren scientist broke it. "He's right," she said quietly. "We can't interfere. Not yet. We need to let it stabilize." The commander scowled but said nothing. He looked at the valley, at the impossible beauty of a world reborn, and perhaps some part of him understood the truth, that this was not just a scientific anomaly, but a living testament to human stubbornness and faith. When the ship finally departed weeks later, it left behind a single transmitter and a promise of observation rather than control. Eli stood at the edge of his growing forest and watched the vessel ascend, a bright streak vanishing into the gray clouds. He didn't wave. He simply stood there, feeling the wind shift, bringing with it the scent of rain that was no longer acid, but clean, sharp, and full of life. The planet exhaled, and he exhaled with it. The Academy had returned only to witness what humanity had once forgotten, that life, when given even the smallest chance, would always find its way home. Years passed quietly on Asterion 9. The reports from the Academy stopped coming, their transmissions gradually fading into silence. Perhaps the Council had grown tired of waiting for measurable results, or perhaps they had decided that Eli's living experiment was too unstable to replicate elsewhere. Whatever the reason, no more ships returned. The monitoring satellites in orbit eventually fell dark, one by one, until there was no presence in the sky but the pale sun and the long sweep of the clouds. The human who had once been a cadet remained, not as a survivor or scientist, but as a resident of a world that had begun to breathe in rhythm with him. The valley that had once been gray dust and broken metal was now green, vibrant, and alive with motion. Trees with silver-veined leaves grew in spirals around the geothermal vents, their roots deep and strong enough to anchor the soil against the shifting winds. Streams of clear water ran through channels he had built long ago, now lined with soft moss that glowed faintly at night. The greenhouse domes were no longer visible as structures. They had been consumed by the vegetation that grew through and around them, turning them into living sanctuaries of light and shade. Eli's cabin stood on the hillside above the valley, overlooking the lake that had formed from decades of accumulated rainfall. He had built it from the fallen trunks of hybrid trees, sealing the walls with resin that smelled faintly of citrus. Inside, everything was simple. A table, a weathered chair, a bed draped in woven moss fabric, and shelves filled with his old journals. He still wrote in them, though less for research and more as a dialogue with the planet itself. Sometimes he would leave the pages open outside at night, and by morning the wind would turn them as though reading. His hair had turned white, his hands more lined and steady than before. The years had slowed him, but they had not dulled his curiosity. Every morning he walked down to the valley, examining the growth of new plants, the migration patterns of the small creatures that now darted between roots and reeds. Some of them resembled earth insects, though larger and luminous. Others were entirely new, born from the strange harmony of Earthseed and Asterion's biochemistry. They no longer feared him. Often, when he sat by the lake, small winged beings landed on his shoulder or crawled along his hands, attracted to the warmth of his skin. The ecosystem had balanced itself. The storms still came, but they no longer brought acid or destruction. The rain now smelled of minerals and oxygen, feeding the soil instead of scarring it. The wind carried not the sting of poison, but the soft whisper of pollen drifting across the plains. The temperature stabilized, and with each passing cycle, the air became more breathable. One day, after careful testing, Eli stepped outside without his respirator. He inhaled deeply, and for the first time in decades, the air filled his lungs without pain. He laughed, quietly at first, then louder until his voice echoed through the valley. At night, the sky was no longer opaque. The storms that had once veiled the stars had cleared, revealing a sky so vast and crystalline that it felt new, as if the universe itself had decided to reward his patience. He often spent hours outside, lying on the grass, tracing constellations that had been invisible for centuries. Sometimes he thought of Earth and its endless cities, its polluted skies, its noise. But the memories were faint, like old dreams he no longer belonged to. This was home now. One morning, while tending to a grove near the lake, Eli noticed something that made him pause. Along the shore, a cluster of flowers had bloomed, tall, golden, and arranged in a perfect spiral, identical to a sunflower. He knelt, touching the petals gently. These seeds had not come from Earth. The planet had made them itself, blending genetic fragments from other flora into something entirely new. It was a sign that the world no longer relied on him. It had learned to create on its own. He spent the following weeks documenting the phenomenon, marking every change. The flora evolved rapidly, cross-pollinating across species, forming ecosystems that required no human interference. Even the smallest ponds developed microorganisms that stabilized water quality. The moss that had once glowed faintly at night now pulsed in rhythm with temperature fluctuations, releasing oxygen when the air thinned and sealing itself during cold fronts. It was as if the entire biosphere had synchronized into a single, self-sustaining consciousness. It was during one of those quiet evenings that the Academy's signal returned. A transmission beacon, faint but clear, appeared on his old console, buried beneath dust and vines in the corner of his cabin. He hesitated before activating it. The voice that emerged was synthetic, calm, and unfamiliar. To the human resident of Asteria 9, the Galactic Academy formally recognizes your reclamation project as a success. The planet is hereby reclassified as self-sustaining. Human habitation potential high. Expedition crews will arrive within 3 cycles for colonization assessment. The message ended. Eli sat motionless for a long time. The idea of other humans walking here again filled him with conflicting emotions. Pride, perhaps, but also fear. He knew what the Academy's arrival meant: measurements, fences, laboratories, control. He looked out through the window at the valley, where the golden flowers swayed gently under the twilight. The thought of metal instruments slicing into that soil filled him with quiet dread. The next morning, he began dismantling his transmitter. He buried the components deep in the ground near the lake and covered them with rocks and roots. If the Academy came, they would find the world transformed, but they would not find him. His purpose here was complete. He had taught the planet to live again. It did not need him anymore, and he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Over the next few days, he walked farther than he ever had before, beyond the ridges that bordered his valley, through forest that hummed with the sound of insects and soft breezes. He found places where waterfalls fell from cliffs into deep, crystalline basins, where the moss-covered stones glowed blue in the dusk. He saw vast plains where new kinds of trees spread in symmetrical patterns, creating natural canopies that glistened after rain. Everywhere he went, the planet seemed to recognize him, opening paths through thick vegetation, guiding him onward. When he returned to his cabin, he spent one final night writing. His last journal entry was simple. Home isn't where you are allowed to live. It's where life insists on living with you. He placed the notebook on the table and left the door open so the morning light could find it. Then he walked down to the lake. The air was warm, filled with the sound of rippling water and the rustle of leaves. He sat on the shore, his reflection merging with the shimmering green of the surface. The wind carried pollen across the lake like drifting stars. As he watched, a flock of the small winged creatures he had named lumens gathered around him. They circled in slow spirals, their wings scattering faint light. He smiled, his breath calm and even. The world had changed because he believed it could, and now it would outlive him by millennia. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of Asterion 9 fill him completely. The distant echo of waterfalls, the rustle of the forest, the hum of a living planet that had finally found its rhythm again. By the time the next dawn rose, Asterion 9 was covered in a blanket of mist that glowed faintly under the light. The cabin stood empty, its walls entwined with vines, the open journal resting beside a cup of still water. No one knew what became of the man who had stayed behind, but his work remained everywhere: the trees, the rivers, the air itself. When, decades later, the first human colony ship landed in the same valley, the explorers stepped into air that was clear and breathable, surrounded by an ecosystem more balanced than any on record. They found no ruins, no machinery, no sign of human habitation, only the faint remnants of wooden walls, and inside, a single page of writing preserved by resin and sunlight. It read, "The planet is awake now. Treat it gently. It remembers." And so, Asterion 9 became the first world in the galaxy to be officially classified as self-born, not terraformed, not engineered, but reborn through understanding, patience, and the stubborn faith of one human who refused to abandon what others declared uninhabitable. Under its green skies and shimmering lakes, life continued without interference, growing in silent harmony. In the end, the planet did not simply breathe again, it learned to sing.